Life had never known justice, thought Fred Stevenson, detective of the Metropolitan Police, as he leaned against the cold wall of the abandoned building, feeling every drop of blood spill down his hands and across the concrete floor. The bullet, too fast for the vest to stop, had torn through his side, leaving behind a hollow that pulsed with pain and threatened to drag him into darkness. His trembling fingers pressed against the wound, but every attempt to stem the crimson river was futile. He let his head fall back, watching the dance of shadows and mold across the ceiling, and the only spark of hope that remained was that backup might arrive before he fully slipped into the void. These vests, he thought bitterly, aren't worth a damn. Questions swarmed in his mind, but they no longer made sense. When a man can already feel the cold breath of death against his neck, questions become useless and answers meaningless. They said that in one's final moments, life flashes before one's eyes, that a man faces all the images he thought he'd forgotten. But Fred saw only emptiness, a space without color or comfort. With a sigh, he closed his eyes, searching for a single peaceful image, something to soften the tearing pain. But his memories were few and fragile, as the life itself had squandered them on senseless moments and allowed the real ones to fade. It wasn't that he had lived through the years had lived through him. For years he had been a man in service to London, forsaking family dinners, missing birthdays and holidays, spending everything he had to make the city safer for his daughter. But what had he truly achieved? The city was still the same, rotten, crawling with human filth that multiplied like rats and devoured whatever good remained. Even when he tried to recall the bright moments, the memory of his wedding day to Rosalie turned bitter, a reminder of a separation never made official, but final, all the same. And the thought of his daughter Matilda's birth brought an even sharper pain, for it reminded him of his weakness before Anya, of the terror in little Kai's eyes when the gun was pointed at her. Her eyes, those eyes he was supposed to protect, still haunted him, even now. "You're hallucinating," he told himself silently. "This isn't real." But even the thought brought no peace. Exhausted, he sighed again and wiped his face, smeared more with blood and sweat than with life. His mind drifted back to the day he had first seen Kai, at that charity football match, a moment pure and untouched, filled with something that almost felt like happiness. It hurt, because he didn't want to die. He could feel with brutal clarity how unfair life truly was, had always been, and now it was stealing from him again, robbing him of the child he had only just begun to know. The time he needed to build a bridge toward her was bleeding away faster than he could hold it in his hands. A sudden crack of wood, or perhaps metal, echoed through the surrounding darkness, snapping him out of his thoughts. He wasn't dead, not yet. His breathing was ragged, but it was still there. He didn't have time to prepare before a young man stepped into the room, a sneer plastered across his face. Their eyes met, and Fred instantly recognized him, the same bastard who had beaten him earlier without mercy. "There you are, you filthy cop," the man jeered, his tone dripping with mockery. "Pretty fast for an old guy like you." Fred's gaze was hard, though his body was failing him. In his mind, the thug was too slow to admire and too foolish to fear, but he said nothing, unwilling to give him the satisfaction. "What, cat got your tongue?" The man pressed on. "I'd love to hear that whimper again, like when I hit you with my toy." He lifted his gun with lazy arrogance, but Fred only answered with a faint, sardonic smile, the kind worn by a man who knows that death loses its sting when it comes from someone faceless, someone who means nothing. The shot could come any second. The weapon was already trained on him, and the impatience in the young killer's eyes betrayed his inexperience. "What's so funny, old man?" he asked, a tremor of unease in his voice. Fred decided to speak one last time, not in defense, but as his own epitaph. "Nothing. Absolutely nothing," he murmured. "Just, when you kill me, try not to piss yourself from fear. Not very convenient for the forensics team." If he had to go, he would go with mockery on his lips, a final act of defiance against a life that owed him nothing. He closed his eyes and waited for the shot. It came, loud and inevitable, but instead of pain, he felt a spray of warmth across his face. The liquid wasn't his. When he opened his eyes, he saw the young man collapse beside him, blood pouring from a hole in his skull. A voice echoed through the static in his ears. "Officer down. Repeat, we have an officer down. Mark the location and send medical, now." Detective Lewis dropped to his knees beside him, pressing down on the wound and looking at him with a mixture of desperation and hope. Fred's face was pale as plaster, his eyes clouded, but still searching, for meaning, perhaps, or for peace. "You're more dead than alive," Lewis muttered, voice shaking. But Fred found enough strength to answer, his voice faint, his eyes flickering one last time. "Probably because I am." Lewis let out a bitter laugh. There was no room for humor now, and yet humor was all that kept the world from collapsing. "You didn't even try to crawl? To fight?" he asked as blood seeped through his fingers. Fred gave a slight shrug, a gesture halfway between surrender and acceptance. "Why crawl?" he whispered. "Die today or die tomorrow. What difference does it make?" Lewis frowned, but his hands didn't leave the wound. "And what about your mission? Your dream of cleansing London of crime? Look where it's brought you." Fred's voice was faint, but honest. "I wanted justice, but somewhere along the way, I lost hope. Why keep fighting for something that was doomed from the start?" "Because that's your job. You're a cop, Fred," Lewis replied, his tone caught between anger and fear. Fred closed his eyes for a moment, gathering what little strength he had left before forcing them open again. Each breath came harder than the last. "But I'm also a man and a father." Each word was a battle, a desperate pull against the darkness closing in. "I'll fight against evil, for my daughters, until my last breath." Silence fell between them. The only sound left was Fred's breathing, shallow, uneven, and fading. Lewis startled at his words. "Daughters?" he asked, confused. "I thought you only had one." Fred's lips curved into a faint, almost ghostly smile. "No, Lewis, I have two. Matilda and Kai. If I don't make it back, make sure Matilda stays with Anya." His voice cracked, but the resolve in it remained unbroken. "Who's Anya?" Lewis looked lost, searching Fred's eyes for an answer, but there was no time left for explanations. "Kai's mother. She'll take Matilda in." Fred's body trembled as he coughed, blood spilling from his mouth and staining his lips. Whatever strength had kept him alive was now slipping away. Lewis gripped his shoulder tightly. "You're not dying, Stevenson. I swear you're not." But the words sounded distant, like echoes from another world. The noise around him blurred into a dull hum. His vision dimmed, lashes heavy as lead, until his head fell back onto the cold concrete. His body finally yielded to what his mind had long known. Fred drifted into darkness, and the last thing that remained was the fragile hope that Lewis's promise wouldn't be in vain. Rain drummed relentlessly against the glass windows of the small bookshop on the corner of the square in Soho, so fierce and determined that it seemed as if the sky itself had decided to wash away every trace of residue from its depths, uncaring of what it might take with it. Droplets slid down the glass in unbroken trails, like tears no one bothered to wipe away, their persistence turning the scene into a melancholic play about impermanence. It was Monday, gray and heavy, one of those mornings when even time feels tired, as if it too has lost its purpose, as if it senses the weight of existence and holds its breath before its own emptiness. Anya stood behind the counter, with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She didn't hold it for the taste, but for the faint comfort of touching something that could still pretend to be warm. Her eyes flicked to the clock, which ticked 10 past 10. It was still early, too early for the day to have already given up on her. Yet inside her chest, she felt that dull quiet of sorrow, that inexplicable emptiness that no words could chase away and no movement could drown. It crept into her bones, soft but relentless. Her stomach grumbled lightly, more in protest than true hunger. She hadn't eaten a bite since morning. She was hungry, yes, but not for food. What she missed was something deeper, more elusive, something that couldn't be swallowed or sipped, but was felt instead as a quiet void between two heartbeats. She retreated into the small back room of the shop, that hidden corner where she often went to escape the world for a moment. There, she found a small packet of roasted peanuts and sank into the old, worn leather armchair, the one that bore the marks of all her silences and wearinesses. Her fingers clicked through emails one by one, mechanically, with no real attention or care. And then, the door opened suddenly. The bell above it rang, slicing through the monotony of her fatigue. She wasn't expecting anyone, perhaps just a stray passerby seeking refuge from the downpour. But when she looked up, the sight before her was unexpectedly familiar. "More flowers for you, Miss Woodburg," said the postman, soaked to the skin, clutching a bouquet that hid half his face and a useless umbrella that was more symbolic than functional. The rain had conquered him completely, leaving its mark on every inch of his clothes. Anya quickly hit send on her last email, a twinge of guilt crossing her face for not greeting him sooner. She stepped around the counter with a smile that resembled gratitude more than joy, and took the bouquet from his hands. "Thank you, and I'm sorry you had to battle the rain for me. Is there a card this time, too?" Her voice was soft, almost cautious, as if each word teetered on the edge of something she didn't dare to name. "As always," he replied, with a trace of sympathy. "There's a message, but no signature again." Something inside her trembled then, a subtle blend of hope and disappointment, wrapped in the old, unextinguished yearning to finally know the truth. She set the bouquet on the counter and tore open the envelope. Despite her efforts to stay calm, her heart skipped and thudded faster. No matter how much she tried not to expect anything, hope always found a way to slip in. Anya, these flowers may not be as beautiful as you, but they'll bring light into a room, the way you bring light into the lives around you. Enjoy them. She read the message quietly, then laid the note on the table, with a sigh that held both tenderness and sorrow, as if she had lived through this moment 100 times before and already knew its ending. Nothing again, she whispered, almost to herself. Maybe next time, the postman said gently, handing her the half-damp receipt to sign. Her signature flowed absent-mindedly, and moments later, he was gone, swallowed by the misty morning, by the same rain that refused to relent. It had been 2 mornings since Fred had stood on the threshold of the bookshop unexpectedly, like a storm you only recognize once it's already above you. 2 nights had passed since then, oddly quiet, with no calls, no messages, no sign of him at all. And as she sat slumped in her chair, watching the rain blur the outlines of the city, the question gnawed at her. Why? Why had he been so desperate to find her, only to vanish without a trace, as if the words he'd spoken that night were his last, as if he no longer had the strength to make them real? The card from the bouquet slipped between her fingers. She toyed with it absently, turning it over and over, like a child fidgeting with a tiny secret trinket, hoping it might reveal its mystery, if only she held it long enough. But secret stayed silent, just like he did. Then the phone rang. The sound cut through the silence like a blade, sudden, sharp, and merciless, startling her so that she flinched. In the room filled with the whisper of rain, it was the only sound that carried the weight of reality, something alive enough to pierce the fog of her fatigue. She looked at the screen and her breath caught. Unknown number. Hidden ID. Her eyebrow lifted slightly, but her heart had already begun to race, tightening painfully, as if it recognized something her mind refused to admit. The question rose unbidden. Was it him? And if it was, why hide the number? The ringing persisted, insistent, stubborn, as if life itself had decided to test her, offering a chance she wasn't sure she should take. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, and her fingertip brushed across the screen. Hello? Her voice was quiet, uncertain, fragile as mist rising over a river. Even she didn't recognize the tone as her own. Good morning. The voice came slowly, wrapped in a softness that carried far too much meaning for 2 simple words. For a moment, Anya was speechless. Voices from her past flickered through her memory, but none matched this one. It didn't fit the rhythm, the accent, or that invisible something the soul recognizes before the mind does. Confusion washed across her face, unseen by anyone else, but painfully real. Her heart was beating faster now, as if trying to outrun time itself. I'm sorry, but who is this? She asked carefully, almost warily. Detective Ian Lewis, Metropolitan Police Service. May I ask who I'm speaking with? The words suddenly turned to lead, a cold, heavy lead that sank straight into her stomach. Her legs felt weak, almost foreign. Police? She repeated in a whisper, as if the word itself wasn't meant to be spoken aloud. Her voice trembled. Anya Woodberg. How can I help you? Her heart pounded as if trying to stop time, while an unfamiliar, merciless chill spread through her chest. I called this number hoping to reach you. All right, she replied softly, almost mechanically, and only then rose to her feet, as if suddenly realizing she was standing on the edge of something unknown and dangerous. Her steps were uncertain. Each movement of her foot felt like stepping onto fragile glass that might shatter beneath her at any moment. She began to pace between the shelves, her fingertips brushing over the spines of books without awareness, as though searching for steadiness in objects that remained unchanging while her world swayed beneath her hands. We found a piece of paper in the pocket of Mr. Stevenson's uniform. She froze. Her fingers tightened around the spine of the nearest book, and the cold, smooth surface beneath her skin was the only solid thing she could hold on to as her breath faltered. Fred was injured this morning. Badly. He's currently in surgery at St. Thomas's Hospital. In that moment, time ceased to exist, as if the entire world had fallen into a silence that echoed in her ears. Every word, every sound, every color in the room lost its meaning, dissolving into shadows that merged into a single thought. Injured. The word, so simple and yet so devastating, consumed everything, leaving her no room to breathe. Is he alive? She whispered, her lips barely moving, as if even the thought might break the fragile thread between life and death, and speaking it aloud could shatter it completely. "We're fighting, Miss Woodburg. He's been shot. The wound is severe." "Shot?" The words slipped from her throat, trembling with disbelief that burst instantly into pain. Her hand flew to her lips, and tears flooded her eyes without restraint, as though they had been waiting for years for a way out. Images flickered before her, disjointed, abrupt, every memory of him etched in her mind, now illuminated by grief and light. His smile, his quiet words, that particular way he said her name and left it hanging in the air like a touch. The detective kept talking, but his voice reached her only as a distant hum, like sounds through a thick pane of glass. She couldn't catch the meaning. All she could hear was her own breath and her own heart skipping beats. "Miss Woodburg, are you still there?" She wiped her face, clumsily pulling her coat over her shaking shoulders. Yes, I'm here. You said St. Thomas's Hospital?" "That's right. Could you perhaps look after his daughter while he recovers?" Of course I will," she said hoarsely, already heading for the door, her words scattering behind her as she quickened her pace. "Just, could you send me the address of her school? I don't know where she goes." "I'll send it. Thank you, truly." Her white Volvo roared to life before she even fastened her seatbelt. Her fingers were ice cold, but she gripped the steering wheel tightly, searching for an anchor as the world around her dissolved into meaninglessness. "Thank you for letting me know, Detective. Thank you. We'll be in touch, Miss Woodburg. I'm truly sorry. Fred is a dear friend." "So am I," she whispered, and ended the call because her voice and breath betrayed her. A moment later, tears overtook her, raw and uncontrollable, as the tires hissed against the wet asphalt and rain drummed on the windshield. She drove through the grey veil of London, through a world turned to mist, praying only that she'd make it in time to see him alive. At the traffic light, the red signal blinked like an eternity. The line of cars ahead stood still, and she stared through the glass, unfocused, counting the seconds, each one cutting into her like a wound. Pain churned in her chest, her stomach tightened, her hands clutched at the fabric beneath her coat, as though she might find something there to keep her upright. When she reached the hospital, the blue and red flashes of police lights washed over the building's facade. She didn't even try to lock the car. She ran. The words tore out of her throat like a cry. "Fred Stevenson! Where is he? Where can I find him?" Her panic was naked, her voice raw with anguish that could no longer be hidden. The nurse at the reception looked up, typed his name into the computer, and said gently, "Fred Stevenson?" Yes. Her voice was rough, her eyes red, her face wet with tears. "He's in surgery right now. Is there any news?" "I'm sorry, no updates yet. You can wait for the doctors near operating room 4. "Thank you," she said, but her legs already knew the way before her mind caught up. The corridors were cold and sterile, each step a burden. In front of the door marked restricted access, 2 police officers sat silently, watching her. But she didn't see them, or couldn't. For her, only that door existed, and the space beyond it, where a fight was being waged that she couldn't afford to lose. She leaned against the wall, trying to breathe, but her lungs felt empty. Her eyes were red and swollen. Slowly, she slid down the wall until she sat on the cold floor, her body curled in on itself, arms wrapped around her knees like a child. She had to stay awake, had to endure, just survive this moment. Everything else could wait. No matter how hard she tried to deny it, Fred's return into her life had awakened something she thought had long died. He was the only one who knew how to rekindle the faint ember in her chest, to make her feel as if she was breathing again. And now, as he lay on an operating table, fighting to stay in this world, she could only pray that he wouldn't be robbed of what he hadn't yet lived through, the laughter of his children, the stories left untold, the moments yet to come. "Please," she whispered silently, "don't take him. Give him a chance. Give them a chance." The officer sitting closest to her stood and quietly offered her a seat on the bench, which she accepted, grateful and powerless. The ground still seemed to sway beneath her feet. The other, noticing the pallor of her face, touched her arm gently, as if afraid she might collapse. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Morrison, get her a bottle of water and call Lewis," said the older officer, and the young man hurried down the corridor without a word. "Are you all right, miss?" She nodded, though the truth was far from it. A knot sat in her stomach, hard as stone. Her heart skipped unevenly, her legs trembled, and every breath was shallow and painful. "How long has he been in there?" she asked, her voice faint, fragile. "About 2 hours. We still don't have any information." Anya had always hated hospitals, but not with that ordinary discomfort people feel toward places of pain. To her, Hospitals were the embodiment of helplessness, places where fate slipped out of one's hands, where she was forced to be a witness, unable to act. Years ago, she had spent countless hours here with Kai, while the monitors beeped, the IV dripped, and each minute stretched into a test of endurance. The images of those days had never faded. They remained carved deep inside her. She sat on the bench in the hospital hallway, rubbing her palms together, cold and clammy, as if that motion could warm her from within, not just without. The world around her moved in a strange, slowed-down rhythm. People passed like figures in a dense dream, their voices muffled and distorted, like sounds underwater. All she could truly hear was the piercing, shrill ring inside her ears, and a relentless frequency cutting through her thoughts. She pulled a crumpled tissue from her coat pocket and wiped away the tears clinging to her lashes. A part of her was still in denial, refusing to accept reality. No, she couldn't imagine someone like Fred being hurt, fragile, reduced to the image of a man lying in a hospital bed. Not him, not someone like him. Inside her, there was only one wish, simple and desperate, that he would survive, that he would live, that one day he would come back, as if this was nothing more than a bad dream that would scatter with the morning light. Anya? The voice, unfamiliar, cut through her storm of thoughts. She looked up and saw a police officer she hadn't seen before. He was holding a small bottle of water, and as he approached and sat beside her, he handed it over. "Thank you," she murmured, clutching the bottle, the coolness of the plastic bringing a fleeting clarity to her mind. "Detective Lewis. Woodburg, Anya, but you already know that." Her lips moved in a faint attempt at a smile as she offered her hand. He took it firmly, though not harshly. "Has anyone come out with any news?" "No," she replied softly, her voice hollow, drained of all strength, as though even the words themselves were weary from the journey out of her chest. Lewis took a folded piece of paper from the inside pocket of his jacket and handed it to her. "This is the address of Matilda's school. The girl still doesn't know anything." "What do you expect me to do?" "If you're able to," he said, his voice a careful mix of professionalism and human concern. "Look after her while Fred recovers. His parents are out of town. They're staying in the countryside, and I'd rather Matilda be near someone familiar when Fred wakes up." Anya took a deep breath and looked at the paper in her hand, crumpling it slightly, as if drawing strength from it, as though that thin sheet carried the weight of a new responsibility she had no choice but to accept. "I'll do it, but I have one question." "Of course." She lifted her gaze to his eyes, attentively, yet cautious. "Where's Matilda's mother? I'm sure Rosalie would take better care of her child than I ever could." "Rosalie?" She nodded. "Rosalie Stevenson. Yes, Fred's wife." The detective hesitated, rubbing his chin, and the motion alone betrayed his discomfort. "You don't know? What should I know?" she asked, her tone suddenly sharp, tense. "Rosalie is deceased." Something broke inside her chest. She stared at him wide-eyed, as if she'd heard words her mind refused to understand. "That's not possible. What are you saying?" "It's the truth. Fred lost his wife in a car accident, a little less than 2 years ago. To be honest, I'm frightened myself. He's my friend. Matilda already lost her mother when she needed her the most, and now she might lose her father too. I don't want that to happen, but there's nothing I can do except wait and hope the doctors can save his life." Anya leaned back against the bench, covering her mouth with her hand in disbelief. Before her eyes, Rosalie's face appeared, her smile, her hair, the way she used to twirl a curl around her finger as they laughed together. Years ago, skipping classes and hiding in the library. Rosalie's eyes were still vivid in her memory, dark, curious, always full of life. And now, learning the truth, she felt a crushing wave of shame because of jealousy toward a woman no longer alive, envy of a shadow, of a memory. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. A bitter question echoed in her mind. Why had Fred never told her? "Judging by the look on your face, clearly you did not." "Excuse me?" she murmured, rising to her feet and almost stumbling as she hurried toward the restroom. The hallway seemed to sway around her, and the moment she stepped inside, she gripped the edge of the sink and lowered her gaze to the tiled floor, trying to breathe deeply, to still the trembling in her chest. It was terrifying, too much to bear. Her heart was pounding in an uneven, painful rhythm as she gathered the courage to face her reflection in the mirror. How on earth was she supposed to act normal in front of Matilda, as if nothing had happened? That child had lost her mother. What could be worse than that? How was she supposed to endure this? How would Kai react? She had to be strong. "Come on, Anya. Don't be a coward. You can do this. You love that little girl. You've loved her since the very first moment you saw her in Fred's arms." Oh, Fred. A heavy sigh escaped her lungs as she tried to steady herself. He would be fine. He had to be. For Matilda, for Kai, for her. She ran cold water over her hands, pressing her palms to her face in an attempt to shock her mind back into focus. Then she returned to the corridor outside the operating room, where Detective Lewis was still waiting. Just then, the door swung open and a nurse stepped out, her steps brisk and assured, though her expression was grave. "We managed to remove the bullet successfully," she began, as both Anya and Lewis stood on their feet almost simultaneously. "It was lodged deep in the tissue. It grazed the pelvic bone, but fortunately stopped in the muscle. However, he lost a significant amount of blood, and the next 24 hours will be critical. His current condition is not life-threatening, but that could change. When will we be able to see him?" Anya's voice trembled, thin and unsteady, though she was fighting with all her strength to keep it composed. It was the voice of a woman holding herself together while her world was falling apart. The nurse met her eyes, her expression weary but sincere, touched with compassion. "Unfortunately, not within the next 24 hours. The intensive care unit has strict regulations. Visits are strictly prohibited." Anya held her breath. The words hit her like a heavy stone. Her eyes glistened, and the tears she'd been holding back broke free as she covered her face with her hands, powerless to contain the pain. "Please, just for a moment. I need to see him. I need to know that he's still alive." "Believe me, I wish I could allow that," the nurse said softly. "Tomorrow, once he's transferred to the recovery ward, you'll be able to see him. Until then, all you can do is wait." "How am I supposed to wait?" she asked, her voice sharp now, almost angry. But beneath that anger was desperation, a woman pleading for a fragment of solace. "How do I wait that long without losing my mind?" The nurse merely shrugged, helpless before that kind of grief, then turned to Lewis. "The bullet will be sent to the police. It's intact. It may serve as evidence." "Thank you," he replied. Then, hesitating, asked quietly, "Will he recover?" "Honestly." The nurse looked at him with calm realism. "We have reasons to be optimistic. His heart held on, and his lungs are responding. Still, the next few hours are crucial. We'll inform you as soon as we know more." When she walked away, silence reclaimed the corridor. Lewis glanced at Anya, who was standing against the cold wall, eyes closed, her head tilted back as if trying to retreat from a world that had become unbearably cruel. In that stillness, in that fragile composure, he saw what Fred must have always seen in her. She was delicate, yet unyielding, small, but vast within. Her vulnerability wasn't weakness, but her armor. He had to look away, because that raw honesty, that quiet strength, was almost too much to bear. Anya touched the inside pocket of her coat, making sure the paper was still there, with the address of Matilda's school, a reminder of the promise she now had to keep, even though every part of her longed to stay here, with him. The thought of leaving felt like tearing herself in half, but she knew she had to. Matilda wasn't a child one could lie to. She was a child who had already lost too much. Anya had promised herself she would tell her the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Leaving the hospital felt like ripping out a piece of her soul. She walked through the hallways like a shadow, and when she finally sank into the driver's seat of her white Volvo, the rain was already drumming on the roof, fine, cold drops tapping against the metal like messages from the sky. She sat motionless, staring at her trembling hands as she tried to fasten her seatbelt. Once, again, and again. Each attempt was rougher, more frantic, as if the motion itself could fight off the chaos inside her. At last, her hands gave up, trembling helplessly as the long-contained tears finally broke through. That was the moment Anya Woodberg broke. In sobs, powerless and alone in her white car, surrounded by the gray streets of London and the relentless rain, she surrendered to the pain. His face wouldn't leave her mind, his faint, bittersweet smile, the eyes of a man carrying grief he'd never spoken of. How had he lived with that weight and still come to her and Kai, still loved them as though he had never stopped? She closed her eyes and rested her forehead against the cold glass of the window. Her chest ached with each breath, every inhale threatening to shatter her even more. Matilda, her name echoed through View's mind like a whisper. That child was her responsibility now, not out of duty, but out of love. Anya couldn't let another child be lost to the dark. "You can do this, Anya," she whispered to herself, meeting her own reflection in the rearview mirror, the eyes of a woman who had survived. On the back seat lay Kai's stuffed fox, small and faded, a toy that had endured too many hospitals, too many nights, and too much silence. It was a symbol of struggle and survival. Anya started the engine. The wipers moved with a soft, rhythmic persistence as she glanced at the paper in her hand. The address. Just a line of letters, but heavy as lead. She had to go. She had to look that child in the eyes and tell her the truth, no matter how much it hurt. For Fred, for us, she whispered, and drove on. And as the city blurred past her, wrapped in rain and shadows, she knew she was no longer the same woman. She wasn't running anymore. She was walking straight into the heart of the storm to protect the one she loved.